Okay, we're going to get started now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Natalie Mims-Frick, and today my colleagues and I are going to discuss our recently released time-sensitive value calculator. I'd like to thank the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office and David Nemso for their support of this project. Before we get started, I want to go over some logistics. First, we're recording the webinar today, and all of you are muted. So please enter your questions into the Q&A box at any point in the presentation, and we'll answer them after we finish our presenting our slides. And we'll have our slides posted on the project webpage, and they're up there right now. And I'll send the link to this recording and also to the slides and the calculator to everyone who registered for the webinar in the next day or so. Today we have three presenters. Everyone's from the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab. I'm Natalie Frick. I'm the program manager and deputy department leader. My research focuses on the time and locational value of efficiency and other DERs, as well as demand flexibility and valuation of efficiency and other DERs in electricity planning. JP Carvalho is a scientific engineering associate. His research focuses on long-term power system planning modeling, regulatory design for planning, and investment in electricity markets and policy, economic, and financial aspects of the US ESCO industry. And he will provide an overview of the calculator during our presentation today. And Margaret Pigman is also a scientific engineering associate. Her research at the lab focuses on end-use load profiles, energy efficiency program analysis, and the cost of saving electricity. And she'll be providing a demonstration of how to use the calculator. Before I talk about our new tool, I want to provide some background about what the time-sensitive value of efficiency is and why we created this calculator. So the time-sensitive value of efficiency considers when efficiency occurs and the economic value of the energy or demand savings to the electricity systems at that time. And the graphic on the left there is an end-use load profile from NREL's recently released end-use load profiles for the residential and commercial building stock. So those are a resource that we're making use of in this calculator. The Building Technologies Office at the Department of Energy has supported LBNL's time-sensitive work for several years, and these are links to a few of our reports that we've done. I'll go over some of the results quickly in the next few slides. Our first two reports calculated the time-sensitive value of efficiency for 5 different measures in 5 locations, and that's what all of these graphics are from. So in the top left, we mapped out the electricity system shape for the 5 regions. It was the Pacific Northwest, Michigan, California, Massachusetts, and Georgia. And we chose the Pacific Northwest because it was a winter peaking system, and all of the other systems are summer peaking. And then the 5 measures we looked at are shown in the top right chart, which are an exit sign, a water heater, air conditioner, and then residential and commercial lighting. And those stacked bars represent the different value streams of the measures in the Pacific Northwest for that particular example. Then if you go to the chart that's on the bottom, what this shows is the ratio of total energy savings, to the total time-sensitive value for efficiency. So if the ratio is above 1, then there's additional value beyond just the energy value for those efficiency measures. We created this ratio so you could look at the comparison across the regions. So that was what our first few years of research focused on. After that, we put together a report on the time-sensitive value of efficiency use cases, and we focused on efficiency planning, distribution system planning, integrated resource planning, rate design, and state policies. And then most recently, a report that my colleagues wrote looked at the hourly saving shapes from residential space conditioning measures from 18,000 efficiency projects in California. And the findings from that report found that using the time-sensitive value of efficiency increased the value of the air conditioning savings from 37 to 53%, so significant increase. And then also that the marginal resource is going to impact the value of your efficiency savings, which is what those charts show. From here, we, after creating those reports and disseminating them out into the world, we talked to people about what other resources would be useful. And we found that there's increasing interest in how efficiency can provide value to the electricity system as changes due to the increased adoption of DERs, technology cost reduction, and generation retirements emerge. And so we thought we would put together this calculator, in particular because there's a lack of publicly available data and tools that allow regulators, state energy offices, utilities, stakeholders to assess the time-sensitive value of efficiency and the other DERs. And so we went through and identified a lot of different data sources in addition to building the calculator so that people who don't have access to that data from their utility or from a planning resource can still make use of this and understand the value of different measures at different times on their system. I'm going to hand it over to JP now, and he is going to talk about the time-sensitive value calculator.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Next slide. I'm going to provide a number of conceptual overview of the calculator. Later on, my colleague Margaret would cover a demo which will go in much more detail showing the specific components of the calculator and how they're used in reality. As Natalie mentioned, the main objective of the calculator is to allow users to assess the hourly value of demand-side measures throughout the United States using a consistent and transparent and accessible approach. For this, there are three main features that the calculator includes. One is being at the core publicly available and free. You can download it from our website and start using it right away. It uses hourly profiles for up to 6 measures, and it monetizes their value for 5 hourly value streams and 1 annual value stream. And it produces a number of outputs in a tabular and graphical format. And the idea of the calculator, and this calculator is programmed as an Excel spreadsheet, and this is part of the standing behind the idea of it being publicly available and accessible, because Excel, as you know, is one of the most common tools out there, and especially aiming, sorry, especially aiming at state energy staff and public utility commission staff that typically do not have access to specialty tools. Programming the calculator in Excel, in Microsoft Excel, allows for that access. Next slide. Very generally, this is how the general the data flow works for the calculator. So to the left here, the two blue boxes show the two main data elements going into the calculator. So one is hourly avoided costs in an 8760 format. 8760 means 8,760 hours per year format for an n number of years, and the calculator n is established at 8 years. Typically, you would calculate out the first 5 years from the present year, and then you will add 3 subsequent years, usually every 2 or every 5 years, to get a better sense of what's happening towards down the future. We will go into more detail about these avoided costs. In this case, I'm showing, for example, one of them could be electric energy. The other key component is hourly measure shapes, and these are either savings shapes or end-use load profile shapes that are also in an 8760 format, but these are only for 1 year. So in this case, we're limiting the calculator for simplicity to have 1 year's worth of savings, and then that same year is replicated over time. So this means that we're doing away with any degradation on efficiency, but we're simplifying the calculator and making it portable. In some ways, having all these hourly data, as you may think, does create a bulk amount of data that goes into the calculator, and we had to make some trade-offs between the details of the data and the granularity versus making it portable and tractable. To the center of this diagram, you see some of the processing that happens. In one case, we fold in financial parameters like a measured lifetime and a discount rate to produce net present value calculations. And then on the other, we directly process measure shapes and avoided costs to produce average or typical day results and specific day results, where you can visualize what's going on a given time frame. And we'll show some of these later on. Next slide. Right now, the calculator is programmed with 6 typical or common value streams, 5 of which are hourly: the avoided electric energy, 3 deferred electric capacity at the generation, transmission, and distribution level, and avoided CO2 emissions that come from actual emissions profiles that are then monetized on a side spreadsheet that we have developed, and that Margaret will also talk about later on. And then we have a single system risk mitigation annual stream that it's a percent over the aggregate of the other monetary streams. That is the typical way in which it's implemented. Now, even if the calculator is programmed with these 6 streams, there's nothing in there that prevents you from changing the streams to other ones, as long as you change the labels, or you know how what the label really means for what the data you're putting in. There's nothing particular about any value stream, at least within the hourly ones, that doesn't allow you to put in, for example, an ancillary service type of service, for example, that you wanted to try to record or calculate. The only caveat there is that most of our visuals have their axis already labeled with this value stream, so there will be a little interpretation to understand what's going on. But from a calculator perspective, you can certainly change value streams if you want. On the measure side, we allow for up to 6 measures. They can be consumption, they can be savings, or they can be generation. And you can even fold in, for example, battery operation, and the calculator will process negative and positives in terms of discharge and charging of the battery. These are characterized by hourly shapes for 1 year, as I mentioned. And for example, as a publicly available source for these is a RESTOC and ComsDoc end-use load profiles developed by NREL. And in addition, you have to provide the lifetimes of each measure in an easy, accessible way to allow for the financial calculations that come with the calculator. Next slide. As I was mentioning, in terms of the main features, the calculator monetizes 1 year of a measure shapes by doing this basic multiplication of the demand, or each hour's demand by the corresponding hour's costs, and then, you know, in an hour-by-hour basis. And it does this for these 8 analysis years that are chosen by the user. One key feature of having these 8 different years is that users can choose to reflect changes of the generation mix over time. And this may mean that, for example, the deferral of distribution capacity cost may be changing over time for some reason. They may be getting more expensive or more cheaper, or for example, you can reflect if the region you're analyzing is going to have generation mixes that will have very low marginal costs in the near future, you can reflect that on these hourly structures. So that allows you to really recognize the evolution of resource portfolios that will start happening in the next decade or so. The calculator provides an easy way to include or switch on and off avoided cost values. So you can, in the tabular and in the visual or graphical outputs, you can be switching on and off these values to produce different types of comparisons as needed. For example, if in your jurisdiction the avoided cost of carbon is not relevant, you can switch it off easily and then just conduct the calculator without that particular value stream, without the need to delete more than just pressing a button and turning it off. We developed a pretty thorough user guide, and that you may have taken a look and downloaded already. It comes with a calculator, and among other things, the user guide details how to populate the calculator with available data from RESTOC and ComsDoc end-use load profiles, and from the Cambium dataset. All of these developed by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab. And this provides a default data set for the continental US. So essentially, after you download the calculator, which is an empty vessel as is, and this is to make it more portable and more flexible, you have clear instructions on how to download, restock, ComsDoc, and Cambium data as needed, and you can get going pretty easily with public available data for basic analysis. And finally, as I've already mentioned, the calculator can be used with measures that generate electricity, like photovoltaic, or it can also be used with measures that save electricity, like energy efficiency. Next slide. Thank you. So as Natalie was mentioning at the beginning, the gist of developing this calculator is the recognition that the timing of the measures really matters for accounting for savings. And so the typical analysis these days doesn't account for the timing of measures. It only includes the magnitude of the measure. And in some cases, it will include the measure lifetime. In some cases, the typical analysis will just focus on a single year worth of savings. And it's not all too common that the lifetime for financial calculation aspects will be included. The calculator enables two types of analysis that fill in all these gaps. The shape plus analysis includes all the timing of the measure, the magnitude, and the measure lifetime, and allows you to essentially do a comparison of different measure shapes and their impact, taking into consideration the life of the measure. So it's essentially comparing groups of measures as a program. The shape only analysis is quite interesting. It essentially responds to the idea of, if I had 1 kilowatt hour of savings and I spread it over the year with a certain timing, what would be more valuable in terms of comparing measures? And so the shape only analysis allows you to compare measures on an equal basis, which could be a very important tool to create portfolios or to design programs. In the next couple of slides, I will show how these work in reality. So what you're seeing here to the left is one of the key output visuals from the calculator. Is showing the net present value of 6 different measures over their lifetime, and it's showing for in the colored bars the 6 different value streams and how they weigh against each other for that particular measure. So, for example, in this case, the table is showing how someone is assessing a set of 6 different measures that have already a certain amount of total savings per year assumed. And this is, for example, assessing a program, 6 measures that belong to a program. And so it is, for example, expected that office lights that have 150 megawatt hour savings per year will be the ones that have the higher MPV. But it's interesting, for example, to compare against residential cooling all the way to the left that have a slightly smaller MPV, but it's really it's also a measure that has 50% less magnitude of savings. So this is already telling us that the net present value, or the value of residential cooling, is probably higher on an equal basis. But even though this particular chart doesn't help us with that, this chart does help us to understand what are the main contributors of savings. So we can see that, for example, for the residential cooling, and office lights, the blue bar, the avoided electric energy, is pretty relevant as a savings component. And then in terms of the deferred capacity, the deferred transmission and generation capacity are relatively small, for example, compared to the deferred electric distribution capacity in those particular measures. So that's also telling us very interesting information about the sources of the different savings. In the next slide, I show how things change when you do a shape-only analysis. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, we assume that there's a 1 kilowatt hour saving for each measure, and then we just see what is the value of that kilowatt hour spread over the year given the measure hourly shape. And this is where, for the residential cooling in this example, becomes more valuable than the office lights as anticipated, because of the profile of its savings and the timing of its savings makes it a more valuable measure on an equal basis and on a normalized basis compared to the office lights. And the calculator is allowing this analysis and these results to be easily accessible, and of course to manipulate and test and calibrate different potential parameters to test the robustness of these findings. In the next slide, I just want to clarify. I've been talking a fair amount about what a calculator does, but it's also important to clarify what it is not. It is not a building energy model or a building level tool or a building performance or project tracking database. There's nothing in the calculator that calculates or simulates anything about buildings. It relies on information calculated exogenously, particularly the hourly shapes that are generally produced, taking into consideration building tools, but those act as inputs to the calculator, and the calculator itself does not do anything related to building assessments. It is also not an optimization or dispatch model. It does not do simulation-based analysis. It's really just mashing together these 2 big hourly chunks of value streams and measure shapes. And it is a component of a cost-benefit analysis tool. It doesn't have any costs embedded, but it does get really well the benefit portion, which is what we're aiming for. And so in an out of model process, you can fold in costs of measures and programs as needed, and you potentially can use a calculator as a cost benefit analysis component as a benefit, but in itself it's only a benefit only tool. And just finally, out of questions that we have gotten over the last few months, it is not a data dictionary, and it's not measure and use specific. As I mentioned, there's 6 measures that are coded in number, but you can always populate those measures with whatever you want as long as you have profiles for them. Next slide. So very quickly, how the project, this project was developed, just so you know, we started, as Natalie was mentioning at the beginning in the intro, with identifying the state, needs, and interests in the calculator and talking with a number of stakeholders through interviews. Then we created a technical advisory group that guided the development of the calculator and with whom we met regularly to test assumptions going into the calculator, the design, the trade-offs that we had to make, and then eventually to test the calculator itself. We spent a fair amount of time developing in this, the third and fourth buckets here, identifying data sources and then developing the calculator and doing it back and forth here to make sure that the development of the calculator and the structure was consistent with what was available out there. We didn't want to create a calculator that was overly ambitious in terms of the data types that people wouldn't find easily accessible data to put in. And on the other hand, we wanted to try to create the most sophisticated tool available that was still tractable and transparent. And finally, the last step was to develop our user manual that I already mentioned. It's pretty thorough in explaining how the calculator works, but also in pointing to the user to their different publicly available data sets to populate the different value streams that are currently programmed in. And I believe this is my last slide. Yes, so I'm going to hand it now to Margaret, who's going to conduct a detailed demo of the tool.
Thanks, JP. Thanks for everybody for joining. Next slide, please. So this overview is going to be a bunch of screenshots showing the types of inputs and outputs that are from the calculator, but really the user guide goes into much more detail. So when you open the calculator, you're greeted by an introductory slide to explain what all the tabs do, and they're also color coded. So there are 3 orange results of visualizations, 4 blue results of tables. And then on the next slide, you can see the 5 red tabs of inputs. So next slide, please. The first type of input that is used in the calculator are really the general annual overview inputs. So as JP mentioned, you can input up to 8 years of hourly data, and the first input is just to define which years are being used. And these years don't have to be consecutive, and so the calculator just uses the data from 1 year until there's a new set of data. The next block of inputs are the 6 measures and any discount rate or line losses, and then whether or not each measure should be included in this particular analysis. Then the next block shows the 6 value streams and whether or not to enable them. And that the enabling of the value streams applies to all of the measures. So if you are interested in comparing across locations and therefore have different avoided costs for one measure versus another, you would run the calculator twice with the 2 different types of value streams. You can choose the dollar year for the results and the inflator or deflator to change the dollar basis. And then at the bottom is the electric risk system mitigation, and it's an annual % multiplier on top of the hourly value from all the other value streams. Next slide, please. The next several input tabs are for hourly data. There's hourly costs for each of the 5 value streams, up to 8 years of them. There's the hourly measure shapes for the 6 measures, only for 1 year, as JP mentioned. And then there are 8 years of electricity system load shape, which is not used in the NPV calculation or any of the value calculations, but is used in some of the visualizations. Next slide, please. Because some of the inputs are in a very specific format that might not be the one that is readily available, we also developed an auxiliary workbook to help convert data into the format that the calculator requires. So for example, if you have an annual avoided capacity cost and you need to convert it into an hourly one, this spreadsheet provides 2 methods for doing that. If you have emissions in, for example, kilograms per megawatt hour, and you need to convert it into dollars, this spreadsheet also helps with that. And then finally, the unused load profiles from NREL are in 15-minute time step, and the calculator requires an hourly time step. And so the auxiliary workbook will let you do the aggregation and also align the day of the week with Cambium, because one starts on Sunday and the other one starts on Monday. And in order for the cost calculation to make any sense, they have to start on the same day. Next slide, please. And then the final input screen is about to define the measures that you want to use, and then the measure lifetime. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to get into description of some of the outputs. This is the same graph that JP showed earlier of the net present value of each measure over its lifetime. This is shown in both a tabular and a graphical format. Next slide, please. If you're interested in the savings for a particular day, there's an output that lets you choose a day, and it will show you the a day and a measure, and it will show you the value of that measure for each hour on that day. So in this example, I'm looking at the residential cooling measure in 2 days in June, and on the top right, it's a typical day in June, and on the bottom left is one of the peak days in June. And you can see that on the typical day, most of the value comes from avoided electricity consumption and avoided CO2 emissions, whereas on the peak day, not only is the value much, much higher, it also mostly comes from deferred capacity costs rather than the other 2 value streams. Next slide, please. Another one of the graphical outputs is the hourly system shape for a specific day with a comparison against the measure shapes, so that you can check quickly visually which measure shapes align or don't align with the system shape, just to get an intuitive understanding of how the hourly shapes relate to each other. Next slide, please. And now we're going to get into some of the tabular outputs. I've made an example graph for each of these types of results, but really they're very flexible and you can choose to look at them however is useful to you. So this data table shows the average hourly, or the average value for each measure in each year for each hour of the day. So the average value for the hour ending in 1 a.m., the hour ending 2 a.m., etc. And in this graph, I've chosen just avoided CO2 emissions by year over time for the residential cooling. But you could slice and dice it however you would like. Next slide, please. This next set of tabular outputs is very similar to the previous one, except that it's more granular. Instead of just looking by year, it also looks by month. So in this case, I've chosen only 1 year, and you can see that the value of the residential cooling is much more, unsurprisingly, much more valuable during the summer than during the winter. Next slide, please. This next tabular output is really what is used to make the net present value graph, but you can also look at it in other ways because it's the sum of the annual sum of the value of each measure and value stream by year. So you could look, for example, at the value over time of a particular measure. Next slide, please. And this last slide is just a more detailed example of value over time, both in terms of months in a single year and then those same months in a later year. And so it's similar to the example I showed earlier with the majority of the value switching from being avoided CO2 emissions and avoided electricity consumption to deferred capacity costs, depending on if it's a peak day or a non-peak day. And then the because of the values that were the costs, the hourly costs that were entered into the calculator, the value on a typical day is going down, but the value on the peak day is really rising. So I think that's my last slide. Yes, and we would be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks, JP. I'm gonna take our slides down, and if anyone has any questions about them, we can certainly pop them back up. Let's see, I haven't been looking at our Q&A box. It looks like we have one question that hasn't been answered. Has LBL or DOE developed an analytical model for splitting value streams from DERs into those values that derive from participation in a variety of different streams? So I'm not certain about that. I know that there are DER participation models, but I'm not certain that they're splitting it in the way that you would like them to be split or are asking about. I think that the other point to make about the calculator is that the value that goes into it is from an electricity system perspective. And so participation is something that would be taken into account in your 8760 measure shape in terms of its total overall quantity. And that wouldn't be something that would show up as an output of our model. So I don't know if JP or Margaret, if you're aware of a model to respond to John.
Yeah, I'm responding in the same lines to John in a follow-up question that he had. I did say that eventually, from the calculator's perspective, it's really about the input data. So if you were to be able to, if you could find avoided costs for wholesale markets, transportation markets, and retail distribution markets, you could fold those in to the calculator and potentially estimate the value for a given DER. But it will boil down to finding those available. So essentially, it's not really that it's not really answering the question. It's just saying if you were to find those values, you can fold them into the calculator, and you could use those to estimate the relative share of value in those three different markets. But yeah, to produce that data I agree that I'm sure there is a fair amount of work that has been developed, but in terms of value stacking, especially by NROL, but I don't have any on the top of my mind right now.
Thank you. So we have another question about comparing our calculator to Synopsys avoided cost calculator from their AESC study. So I am aware of the AESC study. I'm not certain about Synopsys calculator. I know that they recently, I believe that they helped out with the E for the Future Energy Efficiency Screening Project's DER cost benefit calculator. And the difference between that calculator and what we have is ours is on a much more granular time level with the 8760 data. And also it's not a cost benefit analysis. It's only, as JP mentioned, the benefit side of things. But you could use this more granular tool as an input to anybody else's cost benefit tool that's available. And I think likely the primary difference between Synopsys calculator and what we have is that theirs is New England specific, if I was guessing, but I would need to go back and look at it to better answer that. But those are just some thoughts on some other calculators. And then we have another question about if the calculator has a mode that determines the value accrued to the building operator or utility bill savings, and it does not. And we don't have anything that breaks it down to participant impacts. It's just the benefit for different measures, again, from a grid perspective. And so, you know, I guess when you go to the link to download the calculator, you have to put your name and your email in because we're trying to track who is interested in using this tool. And we're also seeking feedback on what other features would be helpful, you know, what value streams you would want to see added, what other aspects you would like built onto this, because this was really kind of our first cut at creating a tool like this. And we tried to make it as useful as we thought it could be with the budget that we had, but we certainly are interested in opportunities for improvement, but it doesn't have any utility bill aspect to it. Cambium. Okay, so Cambium is a data set that is from the National Renewable Energy Lab. It is forward-looking electricity prices for the continental United States. I believe it goes out to 2050. They just released a new update. It has avoided transmission and generation are combined together into one value stream. Avoided CO2. JP just put a link for the Cambium tool into the chat, and several other value streams that are included in our calculator. And in the user guide, there's very explicit instructions about how to go to that website, how to download the data, which one of the value streams that come from Cambium could be used in the calculator. So it should be pretty useful for understanding how to use that. If you have your own system avoided costs, then you don't need to use Cambium data. This is just something we're offering as a default data set in the event that you don't have system avoided cost or values that you want to use for your specific area. Let's see. Does our calculator enable users to modify supply side assumptions? Yeah, this is one of the, I think, coolest features of this calculator is that in the 8 years, I mean, so you pick out 8 years. It can be any 8 years. It can be, 2021 through 2029, or it can be a 5-year time step across the years. And you put in the value streams for those years to be whatever you'd like. So they could be based on a generation mix that has a lot more solar in the out years or a lot more storage in the out years. You have to figure out how that's going to affect the value streams on your own, but each year that you put in can be its individual, have its own individual value streams, and you can look at how that impacts the value of your different measures over time. So I think that's a pretty cool feature of it. And then let's see.
I could add to that a little bit,
Yeah,
just to
yeah.
clarify that the calculator doesn't have a supply side element to it. Like there's not a portfolio of resources built into the calculator or that you provide to it. As Natalie indicates, it's indirectly through the value streams that we reflect different resource portfolios or their evolution over time. So for example, a high amount of renewable energy on the grid will translate to many, many hours with very low marginal cost. And in the hourly shape over time, you will see that there's many zero values or even negative values depending on your jurisdiction show up. So indirectly, in for example, in the electric energy costs, avoided costs, you will see that supply side assumption come in. But as Natalie indicates, it's really built into the data and also developed outside of the calculator.
And then finally, I just want to add that the Cambium data set includes a bunch of scenarios. So there's a high renewable, a low renewable scenario. And so the publicly available data that we are pointing people to allows you to choose one of those scenarios.
Yeah, those are both great points. I'm sorry, Margaret and JP, that I didn't ask you if you had any input on any of those questions and was just, steamrolling through. So definitely interrupt me if you have things that you'd like to add on to whatever I'm answering. So some more feedback, I think, giving regulators, they may need to focus on value streams that are within their jurisdiction and control. I think that's a great point, and that's one of the reasons that we made it so that you can enable and disable each one of the value streams. So as JP said, we identified these value streams because we thought that they were pretty common. You can use other value streams and you can enable or disable any of them. So, the caveat being that the charts that Margaret showed are going to have those stacked bars that are labeled as certain value streams. If you switch them out, you need to, post-processing, change your legend so that it accurately reflects the value streams you put in there. But we certainly do agree that it's important to be able to focus on the value streams that are important to you. Okay, so for the gap years where data is not entered, Margaret or JP, do you want to talk about that? I'm not going to get it right. This is a question from John about if you enter 20 and 2035. I think it repeats from the prior year until you get to the next year, but I'm not certain if that's true. And I don't know if you want to talk about Cambium too and how it's only even years.
Yeah, both are right. So we do the simple permanence approach where we just keep the previous year savings to the next year. We didn't attempt to produce an extrapolation or anything, so it's blocky. There's, to 30 in this example, 2030 to 2034 will be a block of the same savings, and then it goes up to 2035 or down depending on what's happening. And as you well mentioned, Natalie, the Cambium that provides information for even years only. And so we do the same approach when populating odd years. We also copy the previous year, don't make any particular assumptions in terms of interpolation. It's just making some simplified assumptions that hope to minimize the distortion that any of these assumptions could make on the calculations.
Margaret, did you want to add anything to that? Okay. So we have a good question about how the calculator can be used to advance valuation of efficiency and other DERs and PUC proceedings. And this is really one of our primary goals with the calculator, is to allow commission staff, state energy offices, stakeholders, smaller utilities that don't have as much resources for efficiency and DER planning, to do some quick analysis to identify what resources are going to generate the most value on their system based on what they perceive the future will look like. Again, choosing your 8 years that are going to define your value and defining the value streams associated with those 8 years. So I think it's a great tool. It's not a comprehensive tool, right? This is something that's supposed to be fairly quick and easy to use and accessible and free, and at least get you to start thinking about if something that's in a filing is aligned with what you found when you're using this publicly available data. And so obviously the data that utilities have that they're using for their planning is much more specific than what is in the public domain, but we think that this is a great resource to get things started and to kind of test out ideas of what you think different measures what measures would be valuable and how those could be used to advance state energy goals or regulatory goals. And then we have one more question, or JP and Margaret, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add on to that. No, okay. And then, is the model and the source code or formulas something that can be modified? And if so, what aspects can be modified? Giving that to JP and Margaret.
Oh, I can start. And Margaret did most of the finalizing of the coding. So I think you, Margaret, may have a better answer for this. But we have not really decided, to be honest, what to do. We originally intended to block, you know, in Excel you can block editing of certain regions in the spreadsheet, and then with a password. And we originally intended to do that, but then in the spirit of the accessibility of the tool and potentially users starting to code their own formulas or maybe modify them, we're still thinking that it could be generally accessible. And I believe the calculator as released is still open to editing. Is that correct, Margaret?
So as released, some of the cells are locked just to avoid unintentional edits of formulas and such, but there's no password associated with it. So if you want to unlock the cell to edit the formula, then you're able to do that, but it won't let you do it by accident.
I think that also raises, oh, go ahead, JP.
I was actually a question for you, Natalie. We did work with our IP folks in Berkeley, right, to potentially copyright some of this, and there may be a license that we chose, which implicitly is a distribution license that implicitly restricts what you can do. So, for example, you could edit the calculator, but you couldn't redistribute it with those edits. That wouldn't be allowed. You could edit it and internally use it. And so there are, if I remember correctly, there are some. I mean, even though you can do it, there are some certain legal things that you can potentially do with the tool in terms of making changes and then propagating those changes down.
Yeah, I don't think have those explicitly listed in our user manual, and we certainly should include those. So I'll put that down as a to-do for us for updating the manual. I think that the unlocking and locking the cells brought up something that I wanted to mention, which is that the calculator doesn't have very many error messages. So if you are finding results from your analysis that are very surprising, then you need to go back and look at your inputs. The calculator is not going to tell you that you put in something that's, you know, going to create some like false result, right? You're never going to see falses that come out into it unless you just forgot to put some of the data in. And so there is some QA/QCing that needs to happen on your own. And, you know, perhaps as we revise and improve the calculator, we'll be able to put in some more protection against that. But right now it's pretty, you know, if you find something very erroneous, then it may be because of your inputs. Okay, so how many efficiency parameters are available? For instance, could a small rural utility model an irrigation load profile with efficiency improvements from an existing database? So an existing irrigation load profile. So I guess this would be like an irrigation saving shape, I think is what the question is. And you could certainly put it in any measure shape that you have 8760 data for, or even if you don't have 8760 and you extrapolate your data set to 8760, recognizing that it's going to give you results that are perhaps more granular than what your data actually shows, can be used here. So if that did not answer your question, type in some more questions and we'll try and refine the answer. But I think that's all of the questions that we have open right now. I don't know, Margaret or JP, if you have any other thoughts or information that came up as we were presenting that you wanted to mention before we wrap things up.
Well, just one thing to add to the irrigation load profile question. The data sources that we point people to in the user guide don't include an irrigation load profile, so you would have to construct it yourself. It's not something that we're directly pointing you to.
Yeah, that's good clarification. So we said this a few times, but the default for efficiency, the default efficiency inputs that we're suggesting are end-use load profiles. And so they're not saving shapes. There's not a large database of publicly available saving shapes that cover the United States. And so the end-use load profiles are proxies for savings. They're not perfect. You know, sometimes when you start adding on controls, your saving shapes are not going to be the same profile as your end-use load profile that they were modifying. But we think that this is, well, it's really is the best that we can offer for publicly available data. So that's one caveat with it. And then we don't have any data sources that we point to right now in the user manual for other DERs, but again, that's something that hopefully as we build onto this tool, we'll be able to do in the future. So I think that may bring us to the end of our presentation. Unless there's anything else, I guess we can hang out for maybe just like 10 more seconds, see if any other questions come in. And if not, we will wrap things up. As I said, I will send out an email that has a link to this recording. It will be on the same page as the page that the calculator is located at. We'll also have the slides, the link to download the calculator. Again, you have to put your name and email in just so we can try and see who's using this and see how we can refine the tool. I guess one other plug is Margaret is going to be presenting on a panel for the Efficiency Exchange Conference, which is the NIA's in the Pacific Northwest, their efficiency conference, and that's on Thursday at, I think 1 o'clock-ish Pacific time. So if you're interested in learning more, you can participate in that conference and hear about the National Renewable Energy Lab's end-use load profiles and how they can be applied in our calculator. So I believe I've stalled enough to see that there isn't any more questions, so we will wrap things up. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, JP. I appreciate everyone who was able to join us today, and feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions or comments.
Or
Thank you all.
feedback.
Yes, or feedback.
If you use a calculator, we do want to hear from you. So don't hesitate to reach out to either of us with any feedback from your experience with the calculator.
Thank you, everybody.